Okay, good afternoon, Year 9. Hopefully this time the recording will work. Um, Today we're looking at the question, how do plants take up water from their roots? Please, at the top of your paper, can you please write the driving question, how do plants take up water from their roots? Make sure you've got the driving question underlined and the date underlined, so just to keep your work neat and tidy, but also allow you to keep it organised so when you look back it'll make more sense. You will notice there are a lot of keywords for today's lesson. Photosynthesis, okay, happy with that, seen that before. But also meristem, specialised cells, differentiation, diffusion, osmosis, active transport, root hair cells, surface area, and water potential. I encourage you to try to say these words out loud. Lots of them you probably won't have ever said before because they're very specific to the plant unit. And if this is the first time you've learned about plants, then there's no reason why you will have used them before. Meristem, for instance, differentiation, water potential, osmosis, active transport, diffusion. Words quite specific to biology. If you're not sure about the definitions of those, we are going to obviously go into those later on in a lot more detail, especially osmosis, active transport, and diffusion, and meristems. Today's lesson is mostly going to be about roots, but also there will be about plant growth and the way that the roots absorb the nutrients and water. Right, why are we learning about plants in the first place? Almost every ecosystem and animal depends on plants for energy. By understanding how plants work, we can improve the yield of crops and help protect our environment that we depend on. Okay, plants are everywhere. Let's learn about them. Start questions. Please can you read the question and then have a go at answering them. You don't have to write them down. Just an idea in your head, just to start thinking about them, will be useful for today's lesson. Pause the video. When we get back to it, I'll show you the answers. Okay, welcome back. How do you test for starch? Can you remember this? Iodine. Iodine turns from yellow brown colour to black in the presence of starch. You might have also mentioned that you would first boil the leaf in ethanol to remove the chlorophyll to show up better. Okay, that was from a couple of lessons ago. Well done if you got that right. How could you test for water evaporating from the leaves? Well, simply you measure the mass of the leaf. Measure it before and afterwards, and if the mass goes down, that means the stomata were open and water has evaporated from the leaf, and if the mass hasn't changed, then no water will have evaporated because it's the same mass. How does the plant get water that it needs? Well, it's through the roots. The roots are the specialised parts of the plant, the organs specially designed for absorbing water, but also other nutrients, other things from the soil as well, like nutrients and minerals. And then the last question was, how does a plant grow? And that's a huge question in biology, really. Very fascinating. Loads of stuff that I could go into a lot of detail, but I'm going to summarise it as just what you need to know for now, as it grows from its meristems. Now, this is the first of the key words that we're really going to delve into. What is a meristem? Well, the meristem are regions of plants where the cell division occurs for growth. So again, you'll see a lot of keywords that you will have been using from the cells topic. Meristems are close to the tips of the shoots, but also the tips of the roots. So kind of in the furthest parts, the tips of the plant, and that's where the growth is usually happening from. The very top of the plant in the shoots, and also the very bottom and the tips of the roots. The meristem contains stem cells. Now, hopefully you remember that stem cells are what we call undifferentiated. This means that they don't have a job, they could turn into anything. They then differentiate, which means that they do get a job, they do become specialised as a specialised plant cell. Okay, so meristem contains stem cells that could differentiate into any type of specialised plant cell. Genius. So you got a stem cell, and it could turn into maybe a palisade cell in the leaf. It could turn into a specialised root hair cell, or maybe even a phloem vessel cell, which allows for transport. It could turn into any type of cell in the plant. This is where growth happens, in the meristems. We'll go into more detail about transport through the plant and more detail into root hair cells today. Stem cells in the meristem are undifferentiated, and they can specialize into any type of plant cell that is needed. Right, again, so this is a diagram of the very tip of the shoot, but equally it's the same things happening at the very bottom and the tip of the roots as well. You've got undifferentiated cells, which as the plant grows, turn into specialized cells. Perhaps it could turn into leaf cells or flower cells even. Right, what is a meristem? Please have a read of these boxes and then pause the video, decide which one fits the definition best, unpause the video, and we'll go through the answers. Right, welcome back. What is a meristem? Is it A, the fastest part of the stem, the fastest growing part of the stem, B, differentiated cells in the stem, C, parts in the tips of the roots and shoots where stem cells differentiate for growth, or D, the parts of the roots where the water is absorbed? It is C. Well done if you got that correct. If not any of these other things, this one's definitely the best. The fastest part of the stem, I mean, it is the part of the stem that is growing, but it doesn't mention the roots either. The C is definitely the best answer there. What are roots for and how do they work? Okay, moving away from just growth, but onto the point of the specialized cell, that is the root hair cell, and it looks like this. It's kind of a funny looking cell. It's got a bit of a nose, this protrusion sticking out there. This is to increase surface area for absorption, because that is the point. Specialized for the job of absorbing nutrients, minerals, and especially water from the soil. Okay. So how are they specialized? Well, the first thing to notice about those compared to normal cells is that they've got this hair-like protrusion sticking out of them. This means it's got a really large surface area. Okay, so surface area, I suppose, is the total area of the surface of the cell. Okay, substances need to cross over from the soil into the cytoplasm of the cell. They have to move from the soil into the plant, and having a large surface area means that more space for the substances to cross over. Simple as that. So, root hair cells are specialized hair-like cells protruding from the roots. Their job is for absorbing nutrients and water. They are specialized for osmosis, diffusion, and active transport. Now, these three words are three new keywords that we haven't probably come across yet, and we are going to need to know the definitions of those by the end of today's lesson. We'll go through those over the next slides. However, what you need to know for now is that osmosis, diffusion, and active transport are just three types of absorption. So root hair cells are designed for absorbing. The first main notable thing about them is they do have this large surface area to maximize absorption. The second thing is they contain many mitochondria. Now, hopefully from the cells topic you will remember mitochondria are organelles which allow plants to do respiration. It's for making energy out of sugar. So because they do active transport, which we'll talk about in a minute, they require energy and therefore contain many mitochondria. They do not contain chloroplasts, however. I mean, if you think about it, why would the cells that live underground be doing photosynthesis? They're not going to get any light, and therefore they don't contain the chloroplasts, which are specialized for it. These cells are so specialized, they do not have chloroplasts. They have lots of mitochondria for energy, which for the type of absorption that requires energy, and they have a large surface area too. Right, which is not an adaptation of root hair cells. Pause the video, think about which box fits the best, and when we unpause, I'll tell you which one the answer is. Welcome back. The answer is C, which is not an adaptation. So, A large surface area to increase absorption is lots of mitochondria for energy, for absorbing certain nutrients is extend out between soil particles is an adaptation. They do not have many chloroplasts for photosynthesis. That would be a good explanation of specialized leaf cells, but not the root. Okay, osmosis, diffusion, and active transport. What do they mean? These are all ways in which substances are absorbed into a cell. We will go over these definitions in a lot more detail. They'll get their own lessons in the organization topic of biology. But for now, you do need to know a quick definition, as it helps explain how plants absorb nutrients, which is the whole point of today's lesson. Not just nutrients, but also water, depending on the type. Diffusion is an important process in physics. It helps explain how substances move from one area to another. And the definition for that in biology is it is the passive movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. Okay, let's dissect that. Passive movement means that it's not happening on purpose, or rather it's not forced to happen, it does just happen. Passively happens whether you make it happen or not. It is the movement of substances from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. High concentration meaning there's lots of this substance in a given area, to where there's not very much of that substance. And happening through a partially permeable membrane or a semi-permeable membrane, that could be like the cell membrane. So a barrier that does have holes in it to allow the movement of substances. So diffusion, passive movement of substances from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. That's diffusion. Osmosis is the passive movement of water molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. What you'll notice is that is more or less exactly the same as diffusion, except for water. Osmosis is the name of diffusion, but for water especially. Things do get more complicated when you start thinking about concentrations of water. So a high concentration of water is water particles would be pure water, to an area of low concentration of parts of water would be salty. However, you could describe a solution as having a high concentration, which is kind of the opposite of that. It does get confusing, but for now, let's just think about it as diffusion, but in terms of water molecules. And then finally, active transport, this is the one that requires energy we just mentioned before, is the deliberate movement of substances from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. This requires energy. Specialized transport proteins. So this is kind of the opposite of diffusion, in that it doesn't move from an area where there's lots of something to where there's not very much, but the other way round, it moves from where there isn't very much to somewhere where there already is. This requires energy, and it has to be kind of forced to happen. Okay, this is the deliberate movement. Okay, let's look at this in a bit more detail now. Got some diagrams and explanations that hopefully will solidify these definitions in our brains. So what does concentration mean? First of all, concentration is to do with how many particles there is in a given volume. So a concentrated solution has lots of particles in the given space, compared to a dilute solution, which is the opposite, which is that there's not very many in a given space. A good model for this, I suppose, could be squash. So concentrated squash, strong squash, has got lots of squash in a volume, compared to weak squash, where there's actually very little squash compared to the amount of water in that volume. Okay, so diffusion moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Would be moving from where there's lots of particles in an area to where there's not very many, or active transport being the other way around. Now, gradient, we also might talk about a concentration gradient. So gradient, we talk about in terms of steepness. So perhaps on a graph, or maybe even just a hill, a high concentration, a high gradient would be a very steep change compared to a low gradient. Right. Unfortunately, this animation is not going to work, but luckily enough, I've got some stills from it. This will hopefully help explain how diffusion works. Okay, what we've got here in the middle, these dots here, this represents the partially permeable membrane or the semi-permeable membrane. This is like the cell wall of the root hair cell and is partially permeable. That means particles can move through it. On the left is where there is a high concentration of these orange particles, whatever they may be, and on the right there is none. Diffusion is the passive movement of particles from the area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Over time, because of the random movement of particles, the particles will move in this direction. They will move from the left to the right. Particles can pass through the permeable membrane and passively, that means without energy, just go there. This is because the particles are moving randomly. We're going down to the particle model, basically. If this was a gas, they'd be moving around with a lot of energy, bouncing around like that, and eventually they would find their way in. Okay, over time, you can see the number of particles in the high concentration is going down, the area of low concentration is going up, until eventually you've got this equilibrium, this equal number on both sides, and this will stay this way. So diffusion is the passive movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a partially permeable membrane, where there is high concentration to an area of low concentration. So there's lots on the left, not very much on the right, and it just moves that way. Osmosis is the same thing, but for water particles. Okay, so where there's an area of high concentration, lots of water particles, to where there is low concentration of water, very few particles, that moves that direction. In the context of root hair cells, where the green dots are could be the inside of the cell, where there are dissolved sugars and things. So it's not pure water is in here, it's like salty, sugary water. And then on the other side of the cell membrane, in the soil, in the water where you've just watered the plant, there is lots of pure water, and so the passive movement is into the cell. Cells can actually change their concentration of their root hair cells, which will speed up this net movement osmosis. They can remove the water from the cell, or maybe even increase the amount of green particles to change the concentration gradient. So osmosis is the passive movement of water from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. Basically the same as diffusion, but for water molecules. Okay. Right. I like to use this model, this gradient model, to help explain what's going on here. So area of high concentration, which is high up here, down to an area of low concentration. Osmosis and diffusion move along. Just like a skateboarder on a hill would passively move from the high area down to the low area, wouldn't they? They just glide downhill. Okay, that would just naturally happen. The plant or the skateboarder doesn't have to put any energy in to do it, it just happens. If you were to move up the concentration gradient from down low upwards, it does require energy. So just like a skateboarder being at the bottom of the hill trying to get up to the top would have to put in energy to push their way back up again. Okay, so plants can do this as well. Cells can do this as well. They can move particles where there's few of them to where there's lots of them, but this does require energy. This is called active transport because they actively have to do something to transport the particles. Diffusion is the passive movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Active transport is the deliberate movement of substances from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. This requires energy. Okay. Now, please can you match the description to the type of particle movement? So, ABC to 1, 2, 3 to I, or I. Pause the video. Match them up. Good luck. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you'll see an answer like this. Diffusion is the movement from a high concentration to an area of low concentration, and it's passive movement of particles. Osmosis is the movement from a high concentration to a low concentration of water. Water moves. Active transport is the movement of low concentration to a high concentration. This requires energy. Okay, thank you so much for your patience, Year 9. That's not easy stuff there, and we will cover that a lot more later on. But for now, let's let's have a look, see what we can remember. So writing phase, please can you make sure you're using full sentences and paragraphs for your answers. So underneath the driving question, if you haven't got that, make sure you've got it now. Start on the describe, then the explain, then use, and then combine sections. So describe the location and function of meristem cells. Explain how a root hair cell is adapted for its function. 3. Summarize the difference between osmosis, diffusion, and active transport. So you could just explain what each one of those are. And 4. Explain how plants take up water into their root hair cells. So using what we know about osmosis and movement of water, and the specialized nature of those cells, how does the plant uptake the water? Please use the keywords at the bottom. Give yourself about 10 to 15 minutes on this. We'll go through the answers and mark them in just a minute. Okay, thank you very much, guys. Good luck. Okay, welcome back. Let's have a go at marking these. Right, make sure you've got yourself a green pen or maybe a different coloured pen available. Just give yourself ticks if you got it right, and if you made a mistake, or maybe if you're just missing some detail, now is your chance to add that in. It is impressive to see students editing their answers after they've had a go. Okay, and it's also important that you are still learning when we're marking things, so adding that extra detail is super important. Okay, meristems are regions in plants where cell division happens for growth. Meristems are close to the tip of the shoots and the tips of the roots. The meristems contain stem cells that could differentiate into any type of specialized plant cell. Okay. Notice the use of differentiate and specialized cell there. You don't need this diagram, but it helps explain that they are just in the very tips. Okay, root hair cells are specialized hair-like cells protruding from the roots. Their job is absorbing nutrients and water, and they are specialized for osmosis, diffusion, and active transport. They have a large surface area to maximize absorption. They contain many mitochondria for active transport, which requires energy. And they do not contain chloroplasts because there's no light underground. Okay, you don't need a diagram, but it does help explain surface area. Okay, osmosis, diffusion, and active transport. They are all names for ways substances are absorbed into the cell. Diffusion is the passive movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. Osmosis is the passive movement of water from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. And active transport is the deliberate movement of substances from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. This requires energy. Finally, root hair cells protrude from the roots of the plant and lie between the soil. Water in the soil is absorbed into the root hair cells by osmosis. This is where the concentration of water particles is lower inside the cell than it is outside the cell. Therefore, there is a net movement of water into the cell. Extra bit of detail is that root hair cells can change their water concentrations by changing the size of their vacuoles. You could have said by moving the water out of the cells and therefore maintaining this concentration gradient. Okay, thank you very much. Make sure that you don't finish before you write your today I've achieved sentence. Fill in this gap by saying describe, explain, use, or combine, and say why. Okay, have you been able to describe the locations and functions of meristem cells? Have you been able to explain how a root hair cell is adapted for its function? Have you been able to summarize the difference between osmosis, diffusion, and active transport? And have you been able to explain why plants take up water into their root hair cells? Pause the video, write your sentence. Okay, brilliant, Year 9. Thank you very much. As always, you've got your 10 questions Show My Homework quiz to show us that you've done it, but also quick test to see what you can remember from the lesson. Thank you so much, guys. See you next time, where we'll be talking about the movement of water through the plant. Thank you.